This one is a complete snow job by the FBI. I'm Aiden Mattis, and welcome back to the Lore Lodge. We have told this story before, actually, on a couple of occasions, and it pains me to say this, I was wrong. I did not do the research I should have done. I did not do my due diligence. But you know who does do their due diligence? Morgan & Morgan. You see, after all of our struggles, Bigfoot and I actually made friends, and we decided that we had one purpose: to go after the Wendigo. But here's the thing about the Wendigo. That boy's strong. With a simple swing of a fist, he knocked Bigfoot right on his butt, and me, well, I tried to escape to look for help. Not to abandon my new friend Bigfoot, of course not, but I tried to escape to look for help, and the problem was, turns out that guy's fast. You might even say that I was injured and didn't know where to start, but with Morgan & Morgan, it's so easy. My body was so incredibly broken that I couldn't move. But with Morgan & Morgan, you can submit a claim without ever getting off of the couch. After my high-speed impact with a Wendigo's fist, I had a concussion, but that was okay because with just 8 clicks or less, you can submit a claim to Morgan & Morgan. Don't be like me, on the wrong end of a Wendigo's bad day looking for representation. If you're ever in an accident, Wendigo hunt related or not, you can check out Morgan & Morgan. For more information, you can go to the link in our pinned comment, or you can dial #law. That's #529 from your cell phone. But you know who can't dial #529 from his cell phone? Charles McCullar. And we're going to explain to you why. But the real interesting bit of this story, and you probably know how it ends, is not what happened to Charles, it's the way the FBI behaved after he disappeared. But in order to understand Charles and his disappearance and the FBI's response, you need to know some background information. And this is one of those cases where the background information is weird, it's unusual. It's not, as simple as, all right, well, he grew up here, this is what he did for a living. No, his parents worked for the Pentagon. You see, Charles Wesley McCuller, or Charles Wood McCuller, depending on which FBI document you look at, he was known to his friends as Chuck, was born on July 20th, 1955, to Charles Sr. and his wife, Isla. Now, Isla was a programmer for the Pentagon. I'm not sure particularly what that looked like in 1955 to 75, but that is what she did. More interestingly, her husband, Charles, was buried at Arlington, which means he was in the military, but no amount of searching the public internet came up with any records of what he did. I cannot figure out what Charles E. McCuller did. I do not know his job. All I know is that when he wrote to senators, they wrote back. But enough about Charles Sr. and Isla and all of that. We'll get to them later. What's really important right now is Chuck. You see, Chuck went to Jefferson High School in Virginia, and he was quite the student and quite the extracurricular activity doer. You see, Charles was in Ski Club, Quill and Scroll, which is an honor society for high school journalists. He was in the Jeffersonian Yearbook Club as a photo editor. He was in the Photography Club. He was in the Colonial Corps, can't figure out what that is, but it would probably get him canceled today. He was in the Jefferson Jottings, a poetry club, German club, science club, and electronics club. So quite involved. Now, he was not in all of these clubs at exactly the same time, but, he did do all of this throughout his 4-year high school career. Following graduation, it seems that Charles decided to spend a little bit of time traveling, working on his photography, and while I couldn't confirm this is what he was up to, it seems like he was trying to build a portfolio so he could just go be a professional photographer and not worry about college, which in the 70s was not that rare. And for the sake of the rest of this video being coherent, I will refer to the Charles who went missing as Chuck, as his friends knew him, and I will refer to his father as Charles or Charles Sr. By January of 1975, Chuck had reached Eugene, Oregon, where he was staying with a couple of friends. I don't know how he met friends who lived in Eugene, Oregon at 19 in the 70s, but he did. Chuck's plan at this point was to go into Crater Lake National Park, which is gorgeous. It is a beautiful place. And he was going to take some pictures, observe the scenery, go for some hiking, and do some camping. Now, in January, that's a little bit of a choice, but as we'll get into later, Chuck had some unusual skills. He planned to leave Eugene on the 29th of January and return on the 31st, so this was not intended to be a very long trip. And as I was researching for this case, one thing that wasn't totally clear to me was what kind of gear Chuck was taking with him. Now, I did find some documents going into great detail about what kind of gear he took, but I wanted to take this moment to talk about the other ways this story has been portrayed. Because if you look at, Strange Outdoors, or even Mr. Ballin, their versions of this story don't match. They both say that he left a lot earlier, that he left Eugene on the 8th of January or the 10th of January. And to be clear, this is not a dig at Mr. Ballin. It's just that he was using David Paulides' research, and David Paulides either got this wrong or somebody misinterpreted it somewhere along the way. I don't know his process necessarily, but I do not attribute this fault to John. This is not Mr. Ballin's fault. And to be clear, this is also not a shot at David Paulides. He's a pioneer. He's doing fantastic work. Just there are some things that I find in my research that don't quite match. A lot of those stories say that Chuck planned to be camping, but as I was reading, I was like, he didn't have any camping gear. What's going on here? But like I said, we'll get to that later. But right now I want to tell you about Crater Lake National Park. The lake sits at the center of a collapsed volcanic dome. So it was literally a volcano that erupted so hard that it just imploded on itself about 7,700 years ago. And the Klamath people actually, like, their history, their story goes back to their ancestors watched this happen. Like, they have stories about it. It has to do with their creator being and all of that. It's a very cool story. And it's just really interesting that we know now, obviously, that this is a collapsed volcano, but that happened around 5,675 BC. So they've preserved this story of that volcano collapsing since before the dawn of civilization in Mesopotamia, which obviously their version of it involves gods and, the elements and this huge, there's a lot going on. In reality, it was just a collapsed volcanic dome, but it tells you a lot about the strength of Native American oral storytelling and how long these things stick around. I mean, that is a long period of time. Located in Klamath County, Oregon, the lake sits at an elevation of about 6,178 feet above sea level, which for our friends who are not in the United States or the one other country in the world that uses the imperial system still, that's about 1,883 meters. Now you see, Crater Lake is a pretty special lake. At first glance, you might just look at it and be like, it's a lake, that's cool. But there's more beneath the surface. At 6 miles long and 5 miles wide, it's not the largest lake in the country. The Great Lakes are far larger than that, but it is one of the deepest. Crater Lake has an average depth of 1,148 feet, or 350 meters, and it has a maximum depth, this is the cool part, of 1,949 feet, 594 meters, which makes it the deepest lake in the United States, and by average depth, the third deepest lake in the world. The park itself covers an area of 183,224 acres, making it about twice the size of the city of Philadelphia. Now, in January and February, the average high in the park is about 33 degrees Fahrenheit or 0.8 degrees Celsius. Rest of the world catch up. We're on real stuff now. Like, we're actually using the proper measurement system. Freedom units. And of course, the park has an average low during this time of year of about 19 degrees Fahrenheit or -7 degrees Celsius. But the important part here, the part that's central to this story, is the average snowfall this time of year, which ranges between 70 and 85 inches, or 175 to 220 centimeters. However, the day that Charles disappeared, there were about 100 inches of snow on the ground. To give you an idea, I am 69 inches tall. Nice. That is, 100 inches is a lot of inches. That is taller than Bigfoot. And while we're on the subject of measurements, let's talk about Chuck's. He was about 6 feet 3 inches tall, which is large to me, 150 pounds, which is lighter than me, so the dude was skinny. He had blue eyes, brown shoulder-length hair, and though most pictures you see of him regarding this case will show him with a mustache, he actually was clean-shaven when he went missing. Due to the timing of Chuck's departure from Eugene, it seems like his goal was to travel on the 29th, hike in the park on the 30th, and then return home on the 31st. Again, at the time of researching this, I wasn't totally understanding whether he planned to camp or use a motel. Turns out he planned to camp. Amongst his equipment, he was carrying an Everest number 228 frame backpack, so that is a hiking backpack that actually has a frame in it that keeps it rigid on the outside so you can fit more stuff in it and carry it more effectively. To give you the basics here. On top of that, he had a North Face down-filled sleeping bag, good for up to -25 degrees Fahrenheit, which is very cold. I actually, one time when I was like 12 and I was a Boy Scout, I went on a camping trip and I brought a flannel and foam sleeping bag, and it got really cold, and I almost died. I had to sit in a van all night so I didn't, freeze to death. That was not a good experience. He had 2 or 3 pairs of extra long Levi blue jeans, which makes sense because he himself was extra long. It was the 70s, so of course he had a turtleneck, wool long underwear, red and blue bandanas. I forgot to mention the turtleneck was white, an assortment of tank tops, one of which had Mickey Mouse on it, several spare pairs of socks, uncashed traveler's checks. If you don't know what a traveler's check is, they are basically prepaid checks that can be reported stolen or missing. They're supposed to only be cashed by the person who bought them. You're supposed to show ID, but in the event that somebody does manage to cash it without it having the necessary ID, you can have it refunded by the bank. That's the idea, is that it's a secured check. He also had an extra sweater, camping silverware, a little Boy Scout style mess kit, a 5-quart water bladder, rope, a pocket knife, and some assorted other smaller items. And in my notes, because I take notes by hand, if you've never seen our notebook, it's a Remarkable 2.0, please sponsor us! But in my notes, it says that he was prepared to eat a meal outdoors, but not to sleep outdoors. I was wrong about that. And I can't really blame everybody else who covered the story for being wrong about that, because you gotta dig through some files to get here. But one thing that was clear to me is that this was not his first time in the outdoors, and he had some survival training. As well, he kept his family updated on the entire itinerary, the entire trip, and I'll go into more detail on that later. The summary of the next 27 hours of this video, according to my notes, is that on the 29th, he departed Eugene, Oregon around 1:30 p.m. He was spotted at Roseburg a few hours later, and then finally checked in somewhere else at 6:30 p.m. To give you the gist of what happened here, as we'll go into later in this video, which is going to be 18 hours long, a United States government memo states that he was seen in Roseburg, Oregon on the 29th. So he left Eugene, got to Roseburg. When he did not return on the 31st, friends became worried and they reported him missing on February 1st. They reported that he had been wearing faded blue jeans, a blue down jacket, hiking boots with orange snow shields, showing he considered snow, so he was aware of the fact there would be snow, his white turtleneck sweater, an orange backpack with a sleeping bag, and a pair of cotton gloves. The official missing persons report was filed on the 1st of February, and his father was informed of his disappearance 10 days later. Fun coincidence, this video is going up on the 10th of February. Now, Charles Sr. flew out as soon as he found out about this. He got there on the 11th, and that is, typically this is where we would just launch into the next part of the story about, the circumstances, the disappearance, the finding, and all that. But the Lore Lodge research staff is just incredible. They are the best researchers you will ever find in the world. Truly an incredible team. And they located some documents. It's me, I'm the Lore Lodge research staff, it's all me. I present to you the McCuller FBI files, and you'll also see them on screen. This is gonna be a lot, so buckle up. On March 15th, 1976, letters. Author redacted, but likely Charles' father. Mom is important too, but it was 1976. Was anyone at the FBI going to respond to a woman? Probably not. It was the FBI, and they don't even respond to the right people now. The letters were sent to Senator William Scott and Representative Joseph Fisher, both of them his actual representatives in Congress. One from his state, the other from his district. The author, which, again, I'm now actually positive it was Charles Sr., so I'm just going to drop the pretense here, would like to enlist their services in obtaining federal assistance in Charles' continuing search to ascertain what happened to Charles W. McCuller. There is a redacted word right before Charles to ascertain what happened to redacted Charles W. McCuller. I believe that redacted set of words is my son. Now, Charles notes that he is aware the FBI does not investigate missing persons cases, but he has heard of another missing person that the FBI is investigating, a guy named James Hoffa. I will say, I know that this was, at that point, 40 years ago, but this also makes it odd that Tom Messick had FBI agents involved. Like, that's even weirder now. Because FBI only gets involved if they believe there's kidnapping, extortion, somebody was taken across state lines, so on and so forth. Now, Charles Sr. actually found out about James Hoffa while he was in Oregon and refers to himself as the McCuller family. So the older McCuller then gives us a timeline of events as he is aware of them. So this timeline is events between January 29th, 1975 and March 15th, 1976. January 29th, Chuck leaves Eugene. February 1st, Chuck is reported missing to all agencies in Eugene, Oregon. The Oregon State Police notified the media and posted pictures of Chuck at bus stations across the state, knowing he was traveling by bus. On February 10th, the state police notified Charles Sr. On February 11th, Charles Sr. flew out to Oregon. His plan was to go to Klamath Falls and start there and then make his way up to Crater Lake, collect all of the information he possibly could about Chuck, and then try and figure out what to do next. Now, the original thought process of the Oregon State Police was that Chuck had changed his itinerary at the last moment without notifying everyone, had gone on a trip somewhere else, and would call back whenever. Or maybe he, had gotten lost, something like that. They didn't think he had gone to the park. Charles Sr., on the other hand, pushed back. He was going to say, no, that's not the case. Chuck wouldn't do that. He's been keeping up with us this entire time. That would be very out of character for him. So from the onset, you can start to see two camps forming here. Charles Sr. is already suspecting foul play. The Oregon State Police are suspecting 19-year-old doing stupid things. And with the available information, that actually is kind of reasonable. That sounds right. Now, to be clear, everybody at this point kind of thought Chuck was dead. He was probably dead by now. And the Oregon State Police were figuring, well, if he's not alive somewhere, he probably did make it to the park and die of exposure. Charles Sr., however, was skeptical, and I quote, because he had knowledge of snow, survival techniques, and his equipment was very good. Now, could be an overconfident father to say, my son has knowledge of snow, survival techniques, and his camping equipment was very good. But as you'll note as we go further on, it doesn't seem like this was just an overconfident father. Chuck knew something most kids his age wouldn't know how to do. However, his family did admit they had no evidence that this was not just death by exposure, they had a hunch. Keep in mind, Charles Sr., buried at Arlington, no public records about him. That is something to remember here. And if somebody has found public records, please let me know, because I was at a loss for this. Another interesting thing, my grandfather does not exist, according to the public records. No, he was in the National Guard, no enlistment papers. He got married, no marriage papers. He got married again, no marriage papers. So you understand my point here. At this point, the search really begins. It's the 11th of February. He was reported missing about 11 days ago. We're getting into it. Right on time, almost 2 weeks late. But Charles Sr., Rangers, State Police, all conducted aerial searches. Interesting, it seems that Charles Sr. knew how to fly. Funny how that is, and he also knew how to camp in the winter in a park that had 90 inches of snow on the ground. Totally normal. These are totally normal things for a man to know how to do. Anyway, the aerial search missions turned up nothing, and Charles Sr. spent months hiking around the park, but could not find anything. There was just no sign of Chuck. He took pictures, he interviewed people, he camped. He, for all intents and purposes, probably should have found the kid. And as he conducted his interviews, he started to collect a little bit more information, stuff that put the puzzle together at least a little bit. For example, 2 people had seen a hiker resembling Chuck on the road from Roseburg on the 29th, but they weren't quite sure it was him. The following day, on the 30th, a logger gave him a ride to within 20 miles of the park. But Charles Sr. didn't find out about this until after he had already left. In the ensuing 5 months, the McCuller family sent out mailers with Charles' description and a picture of him and information about what he was doing to all 86 guests at Diamond Lake Lodge, which is between Roseburg and Crater Lake, and it is the last place that anyone thinks Charles may have been before getting to the lake. Not a single one of those guests turned up a lead. And to give them a little bit of credit, the police were conducting interviews at this time too. But they were not conducting interviews of the guests at Diamond Lake Lodge, to be very clear. They did not do that. They were interviewing people who lived in the surrounding area. As all of this was going on, Cascade Emergency Rescue Service teams were out on snowmobiles and skis looking all over the place for Chuck, and just nobody could find the kid. They even, once again, used aircraft and sent people out on foot, and there was no sign. In July of 1975, Charles Sr. actually also returned, and then went on foot. He flew around, he hiked, he camped, he just couldn't find anything. Now, outside of his time in Oregon in February, Charles had, of course, returned to the park in the summer to hike and camp when there was no snow on the ground because he was just going to be more effective that way, but he didn't find anything. Now, as I mentioned before, Charles Sr. spent time in the park. He spent time in February and also 3 weeks in July where he hiked and flew. Now, after reviewing all of the available information, and of course having hiked the park, the McCuller family came to the conclusion that they really firmly believed that this was not Chuck becoming a victim of the weather, but rather Chuck becoming a victim of foul play. So what did they do? They informed the Oregon State Police. They asked them to look into it. They didn't do anything, so they reached out for federal help. And that brings us to our next letter. Yes, all of that last bit was one letter. It was one letter, and I have 2 pages of notes on it. Buckle up. These letters go until 1978. We are on March 22nd, 1976, where we have a letter from Senator William Scott, a Republican from the state of Virginia, to Attorney General Edward Levi. He requests that the Department of Justice direct the FBI to assist in the search for Charles McCullar, and he includes a letter sent to him. This is the one that that Charles Sr. had sent, and he refers to him as my constituent. On March 25th, 1976, there is a letter from Representative Joseph Fisher to the DOJ requesting the same as Senator Scott's letter. On April 5th, 1976, there is a letter from the FBI director, Clarence Kelly, to Senator Harry Byrd, who apparently also had sent a letter, but that one isn't included in this. I actually did end up finding it much later, but again, that's like 22 pages later in my notes, and you know what? We're going to get to it. Now, this letter from the FBI director, Clarence Kelly, actually explains James Hoffa's disappearance as well, and saying that we're investigating that because we believe it's related to extortion. Nonetheless, realizing that it is possible that Charles McCullar Jr. was actually abducted, he requests information about him. At the very least, if anything turns up and they identify a body as this guy, then the FBI will have the records and they will be able to look into it further without having to go through this whole process. So they can all file it away and, plan on looking into it if it becomes relevant and necessary. On April 6th, 1976, letters from FBI Director Clarence Kelly to Senator William Scott and Representative Joseph Fisher requesting essentially the same thing as the letter to Mr. Byrd. Now, Senator Byrd seems to have sent his letter to the FBI first, and the FBI got back to him first. Another interesting thing about Senator Harry Byrd, he's actually the brother of Admiral Richard Byrd, who is best known for Operation High Jump and allegedly discovering the entrance to the Hollow Earth. That is a video we will get to later, I promise you, but it's a very interesting story nonetheless. On May 21st, 1976, there is a letter to Senator Byrd from Charles Sr. Charles Sr. thanks Senator Byrd for his interest in the case, for his help, and apologizes for not getting back to him sooner. It had been over a month. And this is where I determined that, okay, Byrd must have been sent the same letter as Senator Scott and Representative Fisher. Charles Sr. includes a description of his son, his camping gear, his plans, all of that, as I referenced earlier. But he also notes that the Oregon State Police never submitted any requests for information to the FBI in the 15 months between Chuck's disappearance and now. So, because the state has completely failed to act, it must fall to the federal government to intervene and help. He goes on to make a constitutional argument, interestingly enough, that he and his son's rights were violated because nobody actually looked into this. It was the, equal protection under the law. And he includes this bit as well, because Mr. Kelly's letter was basically like, we don't investigate these kinds of things. So, Mr. Kelly's letter has assured us that the FBI will not investigate this matter. Our communications with the Oregon State Police indicate that they do not intend to further actively investigate this matter. So he's now reaching out not for help from either of these agencies, but he's actually asking for federal funding. Basically, he wanted the federal government to give him a grant to hire a private investigator. Why should the FBI pay for this? Why should the federal government pay for this? Because they failed to do it themselves, is his point. It's a pretty weak constitutional argument, to be fair. And this leads me to believe, this line of thinking from him, that Charles Sr. was either a very desperate man or a very well-connected man, and the more I researched it, the more I leaned towards the latter point. He then includes a detailed list of Chuck's belongings and an updated timeline of events, as well as a medical history. But the medical history was basically he had a few bumps and bruises and broken bones when he was a kid. Didn't have asthma or anything like that. That updated timeline is as follows. If I haven't mentioned it, you can kind of assume that it stays the same as what I said before. Between February 1st and 10th of 1975, police conducted routine checks and interviews with people, but they did not go out of their way to really investigate. They did not check with the family, and most importantly, they did not check with the Greyhound bus company within the appropriate time. You see, had they asked Greyhound about Chuck's ticket the day that he was reported missing, it would have only been a few days from when he actually purchased and used the ticket. But Greyhound actually, keeps all of those and keeps them around in case, somebody has a request or there's police involvement for 10 days. So the police conveniently waited exactly 10 days to inform anybody who might actually ask Greyhound. So it's almost as if they were trying to avoid getting leads. And their reasoning makes no sense. Their reasoning was they didn't even know if he had left Eugene, so they didn't know where to start. But Chuck's friends had told the police Chuck got on a bus out of Eugene. In order to corroborate that Chuck did, in fact, get on a bus out of Eugene and figure out where to start their investigation, all they would have had to do was go to the Greyhound station and ask for their records. But instead, because they didn't know if Charles had left Eugene, they decided to not find out if Charles had left Eugene. And again, I will quote Charles Sr. They could have had this evidence had they made 2 phone calls. They didn't even actually have to go to the office. They could have just called. And of course, Charles Sr. was informed that Greyhound could have checked the tickets within 10 days, but after 10 days, they're destroyed because there's no reason to keep them. Of course, now you can probably get Greyhound records from whenever because it's all digitized. Like I said, 10 days. He was reported missing on the 1st. They informed the family on the 10th. It is almost as if they waited the exact correct amount of time, after which Greyhound would have absolutely destroyed the tickets, to tell anybody about it. Charles Sr. goes on to note that police had determined from tips submitted via the media that Chuck had been seen about 47 miles east of Roseburg. That's interesting because he was seen about 47 miles east of Roseburg at about 6:30 p.m. on the 29th. Now, he had left on the 1:30 bus, which means he had arrived in Roseburg at about 3:51 p.m. So, without being picked up by anybody, without having a car, how did he make it 47 miles in 2.5 hours? Essentially, somebody gave Chuck a ride, we just don't know who it was, and that person never came forward, despite the fact that this would have been pretty obvious, like that this was all over the media in Oregon at the time. So it was probably somebody else who was traveling, but why did he get off where he did? Because here's the thing about that route. Once you hit Roseburg, there's really only one way to go, and it's to keep going east towards Diamond Lake and then Crater Lake. So why? There's now a bit of a time jump because we're going from when Chuck actually went missing to December 6th, 1975, when Charles Sr. wrote to the Oregon State Police Superintendent explicitly asking about their plans to investigate Diamond Lake Lodge, the people who were there, and if anyone had seen Chuck. Now, I can't find the letter that was sent back to Charles Sr., but there was one, and apparently it completely ignored that question. And Charles Sr.'s point here was based on the lack of evidence about what happened. It is not in the least unreasonable to assume that a crime was committed in the disappearance of Charles. There has not been any investigation into the probability of that crime. Again, that's a quote from Charles Sr. He then goes on to admonish the Oregon State Police and actually praise the Cascade Emergency Rescue Teams. And he even compliments the NPS, the National Park System, saying that Crater Lake's rangers were extraordinarily helpful. He goes on to also suggest that the Oregon State Police would have investigated this case more closely had they all been residents of Oregon, because just around the same time, I think it was a couple weeks later, a plane had gone down, and they sent out like 3 planes, 2 helicopters, an entire search team looking for people who were certainly dead. Now, of course, different circumstances, plane crash, you can find it a little bit more easily, it's a large piece of wreckage, but still, it's a good point that the Oregon State Police seem to have decided not to investigate this case. And then in addition to these complaints about the way this case has been handled, he gives some reasoning as to why he thinks this is a crime and not simply a disappearance and a mistake. Detailed account actually starts with Chuck leaving. He left Virginia on January 8th. Before he left phone numbers of the people he'd be staying with and interacting with, as well as a detailed itinerary of where he planned to go and when. This is where I need to mention that Strange Outdoors and a number of the other websites discussing the missing 411 phenomenon get it categorically wrong when they say that he left Eugene, Oregon on January 8th. He left Alexandria, Virginia on January 8th, and he arrived in Eugene, Oregon on January 27th. He did not leave Eugene on the 8th. That is wrong. And part of the reason that I'm so adamant about that is because when sites and influencers and content creators who talk about this topic, this very real phenomenon, when they get these things wrong in such a simple, obvious way, it kind of hurts the credibility of everybody interested in investigating this and trying to bring to light whatever is actually going on. And to be clear, I haven't read David Paulides' account of this case. I'm not using David Paulides as a source unless I say I am, but I can only assume that the version of this story that I heard first, which was the Mr. Ballin version, comes from Paulides, and therefore that this mistake originates with him. Now, Chuck mailed a postcard from El Paso, Texas, en route to Yuma, Arizona. He also called on the 16th and the 22nd from Yuma. Also, to this point in the documents, there is not a single mention of how Chuck is traveling, but I did figure it out. As I said, he called on the 27th from Eugene, Oregon, and he told his family that he planned to return to Yuma to see a rodeo before moving on to Denver, Colorado. Now, Crater Lake is on the way back to Yuma. He didn't take his car to Crater Lake. Is that because he thought his car couldn't make it to Crater Lake? Is that because he didn't have a car? And again, lots of accounts, like Strange Outdoors, claim that he hitched a ride to Crater Lake with a friend, not that he took a bus. He took a bus. All of the documentation says he took a bus. All you have to do is read. It wasn't hard to find this, guys. I literally looked up Charles McCullar FBI files. It was the first result. Granted, it was two 37-page PDFs, but, I mean, if you're going to make content, put some heart into it. We also know via Charles Sr. that he had a $100 check waiting for him in Yuma. Now, of course, $100 today doesn't seem like that much money, but back then, that was the equivalent of 710 of today's dollars. So that's a big check. It also implies that either Charles spent an entire year of his life saving up for this trip, 1974, or that his parents were supporting him financially as he traveled. It was probably a mix of both, if we're being honest here. As I said before, he was also carrying 3 uncashed traveler's checks. On top of all of this, none of his friends thought he would have voluntarily disappeared. On January 30th, a logger supposedly dropped him off at Stump Lake, about 20 miles from Crater Lake. Now, at the time this happened, the snow was between 24 and 90 inches deep on the route to the park from there. So, without skis or snowshoes, he was not going off into the woods, he was not going anywhere except for cleared roads and trails, partially because it just would have been extraordinarily difficult, and partially because, as Chuck's father says, he knew not to do that. And once again, we're displaying a level of confidence and wilderness survival knowledge that is beyond that of Boy Scouts. And on the 30th, more snow did fall, but only about 4 inches. So there wasn't anywhere that Chuck could have gotten to on the morning of the 30th that he could not have gotten out of on the afternoon of the 30th. It's just 4 inches of snow. Now, on January 31st, snow did fall, but not until the afternoon, when Chuck should have already been on his way back to Eugene. And even had there been snow that accumulated that prevented him from getting back somewhere, Charles Sr. said that in the event of an emergency, Chuck knew how to construct rudimentary snowshoes. Charles Sr. also goes into detail about the great equipment that Chuck was carrying. He had a negative 25 degree rated down-filled sleeping bag, a down-filled jacket, a large sheet of black building plastic to keep dry, and as well as matches and some food. Charles also says that Chuck was an excellent, experienced hiker, camper, and outdoorsman. He also says that Chuck had experience with this in both hot and cold weather and had survival training, leading me to the question, who is Chuck's dad? Like, seriously, not to beat a dead horse, but I could not find any information on the guy. I have where he was buried, when he died, and that is it. All I know is that he had Chuck, he investigated Chuck's disappearance, and then later on he died. But as for Chuck and his disappearance, all of the possible routes that he could have taken on the 30th and the 31st were searched. They looked everywhere that was accessible without skis and snowshoes, and they found nothing. Not only that, but they searched with like infrared cameras on helicopters and planes. This was not a simple, look out the window and see if somebody's there. They were using state-of-the-art technology for the time. This is like the reverse of those Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2 missions from back in the day where you had to pilot an AC-130 and shoot the little white people, like the little white glowy people on the map. This is like, you don't want to shoot them this time. You want to go get them. In a good way, not in a go get them like a bad way, like you in a good, okay. So at this point, Charles is pretty firm that the Oregon State Police have absolutely no way of explaining this disappearance unless it is foul play, unless a crime was committed. To quote him, "There is no other presumption other than that he was involuntarily detained and killed." Keep in mind, Charles Sr. has absolutely no fantasies that Chuck is alive somewhere. He fully believes his son is dead. He just wants justice. So on May 26th, 1976, we get a letter from Senator Scott to Attorney General Edward Levi requesting an examination of Charles Sr.'s follow-up letter. On June 1st, 1976, we then get a letter from Senator Byrd. Byrd reaches out to the FBI Congressional Liaison asking him to recommend an examination of this follow-up letter. So we've now got 2 senators writing to the FBI saying, hey, you should investigate this. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. And the FBI's response is what you'd expect. On June 8th, we had a letter from FBI Director Clarence Kelly to Senator Scott. He says that no match for Chuck can be found in any of the FBI's existing files, but they will enter those files. Now, that's interesting because they were supposed to enter his description into those files months earlier, and they just, I guess, did not do that. He also claims, and I quote, "There is no indication of a violation which would empower the FBI to conduct an active investigation." Now, while that sentence does rhyme in a very satisfying way, what it says is not satisfying at all. It basically says, yeah, we understand that the son of somebody who seems to be a prominent figure has disappeared without a trace, and that all of the mistake and natural explanations don't seem to fit, but yeah, you know, we're not going to look into it anyway. And the reasoning for that could be something else he says in the letter, because the FBI's opinion of Crater Lake is that, and I quote, "it is a haven for hippie types who reside in numerous communes." So it seems like the FBI's response to this was, there's a bunch of druggies out in the woods, we don't really need to worry about what happened to this guy. Which, I don't know if you've ever met druggies out in the woods, but they're not the most reliable of people. So it really begs the question, did the FBI ignore this entire case simply because hippies might be involved? It was 1976. That seems completely reasonable. Not reasonable that they'd do it, but reasonable to assume they'd do it. Then on October 18th, 1976, you will note the difference in time here, we get a memo to the special agent in charge in Portland. Subject line reads, "Information concerning possible crime on government reservation." Well, would you look at that? Oh, laddie, what do you know? It's funny how Charles Sr. turned out to be right about it seeming like there was a possible crime on government reservation. So on October 18th, 1976, Special Agent Redacted called in a report that he had been contacted by OSP, Oregon State Police, in Medford, Oregon, about a body matching the description of Charles W. McCuller, which had been discovered that day. The location of the remains is described, and I quote, as 200 to 300 yards, you would think that they would get a more accurate measurement, from the crest of a hill near Bybee Creek in Crater Lake National Park. Bybee Creek's location is very important to this case. That day, the medical examiner from Klamath Falls in Klamath County, which is where all of this went down, was dispatched to Crater Lake National Park to retrieve the body and perform an autopsy. And alongside him, the illustrious Oregon State Police investigator Sergeant Redacted. I have a great quote for you here. Special Agent Redacted advised that Redacted was a prominent figure from the state of Virginia and was en route. Now, who could that prominent figure whose name has been redacted, as it was redacted in almost every other single document in this file dump? Who could that be? Who might be the prominent figure who's from Virginia? Take a guess. Special Agent Redacted requested that this information be presented to the Assistant Special Agent in charge in the event that the autopsy revealed a cause of death other than accidental. I do love criminal justice speak because it's like they easily could say all of these things in colloquial terms and they make it sound so official. It's kind of funny. I mean, this case isn't funny at all. This is a horrible miscarriage of justice, but we gotta find humor in the little things, otherwise we'll just get sad. Also, on October 18th, 1976, the Herald and News, a Klamath Falls newspaper, had this to say. A body had been found. It had been tentatively identified as Charles W. McCullar. At the time of his disappearance, there were over 100 inches of snow on the ground, but my favorite part, rangers were puzzled by his location. And the newspaper suggests, foul play possible? Not yet confirmed. But again, I want to zero in on the rangers were puzzled by his location. A pack and clothing matching those belonging to McCuller were found. And this is why I harped on the person of prominence thing, because of course the memo says a prominent figure. The newspaper article says Charles Sr. Nobody else is mentioned as having come from Virginia to look into it. There's no records of any senators, congresspeople, anything. The only person on record flying from Virginia to Oregon on the 18th of October, 1976. I mean, he flew in the next day, but you get my point. The only person on record doing that is Charles Sr., which means Charles Sr. was a prominent figure from Virginia, but Charles Sr. is not a former congressman, a former senator, a former lobbyist, politician, anything that I can find. All I can find is Charles Sr. was a prominent figure who's buried at Arlington National Cemetery. Who was Charles McCullar? The article also confirms that Rangers David Lang and Marion Jack are the ones who actually discovered the remains. On October 19th, 1976, the Herald and News reports that dental records have confirmed the skeletal remains to be that of Chuck McCuller. Why do I say skeletal remains? Because it's not a whole skeleton, basically. That's the gist here. And if you've seen our previous videos on this, or Mr. Ballin's, or basically anybody else's, you might think you know where this is going, but you're wrong. How do I know you're wrong? Because I was also wrong. And if I'm wrong, Well, it's impossible that I could ever be wrong about something anybody else was wrong about. I'm perfect, as we all know. I've never made mistakes. I didn't even admit to those mistakes in this video. What are you talking about? In this article, Oregon State Police Lieutenant Wayne Tucker says that there's no indication of foul play, even though the day before there was a possibility of foul play, but now there's not, which to me it just looks like he's covering his tracks for completely failing to do his job. The medical examiner did say that there was no evidence of a skull fracture, but all that tells us is that he did not die of blunt force trauma to the head. The article also makes note of the fact that Charles Sr. has spent a good deal of 1975 spending time in Crater Lake looking for his son. And somebody who we do like in this story, Chief Ranger Dan Shawley, that's right, I am sitting here praising the National Park Service. Me. Chief Ranger Dan Shawley remarked that it is still unknown how Chuck got to the area where he was found, as it is rarely visited in the winter, and even then, only accessible by ski and snowshoe. So somebody would have to have skis or snowshoes to get to this area of the park. Now, if you'll remember correctly, we went through the list of Chuck's belongings, and skis and snowshoes were not on there. Now, we do know that he could construct snowshoes in an emergency, but going into a park does not seem like the kind of emergency that would necessitate snowshoes. The article also clarifies Chuck's method of transportation around the country. He was not driving, he was not entirely hitchhiking, he was taking buses. That's why he... That's what it was. Now, why did he choose to take a bus to Crater Lake and not continue on? Maybe it was that there was no bus going from Crater Lake to Yuma, who knows? But the point is, he was taking the bus. That's how he was getting around. But, I mean, they did find a Volkswagen key that matched his Volkswagen key, which I think is where a lot of these rumors that he caught a ride, that he left his car or whatever came from. But no, he was taking the bus and hitchhiking. On October 26, 1976, we get a letter from Special Agent in charge of Portland. I found out this is actually a man named John Devine, to the FBI director. And this letter states that Chuck had been found deceased, 100 inches of snow when he went missing, and more fell after he went missing. Some reports I've seen say even 3 feet. It confirms that on the 18th, Chief Ranger Dan Shawley received badly weathered camping gear from 2 hikers. It was found by Bybee Creek, and it contained a Volkswagen key, which matched that owned by Charles McCullar. Now, this is how they figured out that it was Chuck before they had any of his actual remains, as they were like, okay, that's probably him because that's his key. So Rangers went out, they searched the area, and they uncovered his remains. They located a skull, a lower jawbone, and several other bones. It doesn't go into detail about what they were. Now, a lot of other websites are going to tell you that, the hikers are the ones who found his remains. They're not. They just found the camping gear. The special agent's report goes on to say that on October 18th, the remains were given to Dr. George Nicholson of the Klamath County Medical Examiner's Office. He was the one doing the autopsy. As I said before, he determined that the skull did belong to Chuck and that there were no signs of foul play. But keep in mind, we don't have any of Chuck's torso. There might be a few ribs included in the several other bones mentioned, but we don't have his soft tissue. There's no way to know about bruising, about stab wounds to the lower abdomen. There's no way to know about any of this stuff because we don't have all of his body. So yeah, no sign of foul play from the remains presented, but that was a skull, a jawbone, and what, a tibia? We don't know. On October 19th, Charles Sr., Oregon State police officers, rangers were all flown out to Crater Lake. They went to the exact spot where McCullar's remains were found to try and ascertain how he died. The rangers suggested that McCuller got lost in the snow trying to hike from the north entrance, which was closed at the time, down to a scenic area. They suggested that after getting lost, he tried to cross Bybee Creek, he fell through the snow, through the ice, and froze to death. The reason for his remains being not all there is because when the spring thaw came, the animals came out, they ate bits and pieces of his body, dragged other pieces about a little bit, and that was it. That's why they found him in the state they found him. Now, with this presumption, this suggestion of what happened, there are a lot of questions to be answered, and usually I would go ahead and pose those questions. But Charles Sr. already did. Now, they did find clumps of decomposing hair, clothing, and a few small bones, but this is before DNA evidence was really a thing you could do. That really came about like in the 90s that we started being able to analyze DNA to that extent. But at the same time, they didn't really need to analyze the hair because it was probably Chuck's. It might not have been Chuck's, and that might have told them something, but back then there was no way of knowing. But it was determined that the cause of death was exposure, and therefore no more investigation was warranted. On March 22nd, 1977, we have a letter from Charles Sr. to the FBI field office in Klamath Falls, Oregon. He says, "I have been puzzled and concerned because of the discrepancies between what was found and the conclusions that were apparently reached. He urges the FBI not to close the case and to resume their investigation. He goes on to restate several basic facts about the case. He adds a detail, which is that Chuck was seen at the Dry Creek store 50 miles from Roseburg on Route 138 with a tear in his jacket at 6:30 p.m. So this confirms the location of Chuck, that weird gap in mileage that can't be explained because he certainly couldn't have walked it in 2.5 hours. And the tear in the jacket isn't super important because it could have torn at any point during January, but it suggests that when he sent Chuck off, he did not have a tear in the jacket. And as I said earlier, there is no explanation for how Chuck got there because nobody admits to having given him a ride. And then Chuck is last seen on January 30th by the logger who gave him a ride to Stump Lake. The state of Oregon took the position that it was inappropriate and unwarranted to interview people known to have been at the Dry Creek store or at Diamond Lake Resort. Any of this, despite the fact that interviewing people who were there when somebody went missing is a completely reasonable thing to do. But they were so convinced or determined to portray this as an accident that they decided not to actually investigate anything. And you might be asking, why is this important? Why is the Diamond Lake thing, like the Dry Creek, why does that matter? Well, it matters because Diamond Lake Lodge is the only business open that time of year between Stump Lake and Crater Lake. So if Chuck stopped anywhere between being dropped off by that logger and getting to Crater Lake, which again is 20 miles, he could not have walked it in one day. You would basically have to get up in the morning and walk all day to go 20 miles. Let's be realistic here. It's completely reasonable to ask people at Diamond Lake Lodge if he was there, because he has to have gone there. Somebody must have given him a ride. And Charles Sr. goes on to point out that the location of the remains begs some questions. I quote, "Prior to the discovery of his remains, Crater Lake Park rangers more than once expressed the opinion that without skis or snowshoes, Chuck would have been unable to travel into the park more than a mile or two at most before becoming exhausted. Because of this, the rangers gave no consideration to even searching the western side of the park, because it was believed that there is no way that Chuck could have penetrated that far into the park."
Not a good enough reason to use the word penetrate.
Now, how far did Chuck get into the park? 12 miles. 12 miles from the entrance. Now, I saw a Reddit post where somebody suggested that he went in through the south. That Reddit user clearly has never read the FBI files. Because seriously, like, the FBI files make it very clear that he went in through the north entrance. There's no way he came in through the south. Now, the south entrance was actually open. So the question then needs to be asked, like, did Chuck, would the north entrance being closed have stopped him if he had agency? We don't know. Charles Sr. goes on to say that even after the discovery of the body, rangers remained puzzled as to how he had gotten there without equipment for traveling in the snow. It is furthermore improbable that Chuck would have gone towards a visible crevice in the snow. Like, obviously, if you're looking at snow, it's pretty hard to see what angle it's at, but if you're close enough and you're walking on it, you can typically tell when it's going down. It seems odd that Chuck would have been aware that there was a divot in the ground and just walked right into it without considering it. And again, Charles Sr. is adamant that Chuck knew not to do these things, which means that Charles Sr. must have a pretty intimate knowledge of what Chuck knows about the outdoors. Almost like he had taught Chuck himself. Which of course begs the question, where did Charles Sr. learn all of this? And I have theories. But what about the condition of Chuck's remains? There were clothes in his pack, and the clothes were in good condition, which means they had been protected from the elements. Remember, it had been like 2 years at this point. His sleeping bag had no rips or tears in it, which means that it probably wasn't manipulated by large wild animals. It did have some small holes as have been nibbled by mice, but nothing to suggest it had been dragged around by a bear, wolf, coyote, something like that. It was also partially in the creek when it was found. A foam rubber pad was also found, as well as a pair of blue jeans. The jeans contained no coins, pocket knives, keys, anything at all. So that was weird, because Chuck probably would have been carrying that stuff in his pockets. Furthermore, 2 zippers were found, both of them in the zipped position, one on top of the other, not attached to anything. And they found scraps of red fabric, as well as red buttons, and bits of clothing scattered about the 3x3 foot area. But many of his possessions weren't found. For example, his mess kit, his knives, his sleeping bag cover, his boots, his aluminum pack rack that keeps the backpack intact, or his camera, which is kind of the obvious glaring one here. None of his camera or film were found. And some empty food containers were found, but Chuck always followed leave no trace. He knew not to leave food containers around. It is possible they could have fallen out of his pack, but he certainly would have been carrying them inside the pack. And Charles Sr. doubted that Chuck had fallen into the creek because had he gotten wet, he would have taken off his wet clothes to put on dry clothes. And it didn't appear that he had done that. And most importantly, Charles Sr. seemed to not even question that Chuck planned to camp. But there was a 19-degree average low, 90 inches of snow on the ground, and Chuck didn't have a tent. So why did Chuck know how to camp in those conditions? Who was Charles Sr.? And Chuck's body was found within inches of the creek. If he had died in the creek, he would have been in the creek. If he had survived, he would have gotten out of the creek and probably wouldn't have laid down to die just inches from it. So that doesn't make sense. The positioning of the body does not make sense here. And his remains were clad in underwear, I assume the long underwear, 2 pairs of jeans, a red shirt, and perhaps socks, but his boots were gone. Now, if you find this story elsewhere, you might hear that his jeans were found sitting on a log, and within those jeans, his socks, and within those socks, the bones of his feet. You may have heard that from me. I was incorrect. And of course, as I said before, everything had been removed from his pockets. Charles Sr. also points out that the lightweight foam pad, it appeared to be a sleeping roll, had not floated away. So if it didn't float away in the creek and it didn't float away with the meltwater, then probably the heavier stuff didn't either, like his camera. On top of that, his leather belt remained in his pack, which means that animals weren't scavenging for leather. If animals had been scavenging his food or his body, then they probably would have gone after the leather, right? Maybe they didn't notice that it was in there, maybe something was covering it, but there's a lot of stuff here that doesn't line up, you know? And keep in mind, there was stuff in his backpack. So if other humans had looted the site, why'd they take some things? Why'd they not check his pack? If they did check his pack, why'd they refill it? And why take the aluminum pack rack, but not the pack itself? That doesn't make any sense. So at this point, Charles Sr. does not buy the idea that Chuck died of exposure, and I am beginning to wonder if Charles Sr. was Army Special Forces. There's a lot of survival skills in here that lead me to believe that Charles Sr., due to the lack of public records about him, was probably assigned to some rather covert operations. He worked at the Pentagon, it seems. His wife worked at the Pentagon. He's buried in Arlington. Everything points to Charles being in the military, but there's no public records of him. So you have to ask the question, was he doing secret stuff? Then on April 1st, 1977, we get a letter from Special Agent in Charge in Portland, John Devine. Interesting fact about John Devine, he's from Ashland, Pennsylvania. Why do I think that's interesting? Because I'm from Pennsylvania. So you know what? The first thing he does is express sympathy. He says he's very sorry for what happened. He understands that it must be so painful as a parent. He gets it. However, as is the FBI line, he suggests that there's no evidence of foul play and the FBI doesn't have jurisdiction. That said, he says he has considered Mr. McCuller's questions and he considers them to be valid. He just has no interest in investigating, apparently. Or he doesn't have the authority to launch an investigation. He then blames hypothermia for Chuck's inexplicable decision-making. Now, to this point, I've found no records of park rangers saying it was probably hypothermia. I have found no records of a medical examiner saying it was probably hypothermia, but he's suggesting that the reason that Chuck was found with a weird assortment of clothes is because of paradoxical undressing, and that the hypothermia caused him to act irrationally, which is why he headed further into the park. And he says that abduction was unlikely because the abductors would have the problem of getting out of the park, just that it was difficult for Chuck to get there. So it would have been difficult for whoever kidnapped and killed him to get him to where he was found and then get out themselves. But to that I say, if they were able to get in, they must have been able to get out. So if Chuck was able to get in, then somebody else was able to get in. Right, why would Chuck be there if not being placed there? So it actually, again, a lot of this to me sticks out, and I look at it and I'm like, okay, what you are calling lack of evidence to me is evidence of something you don't want to admit. You know, at what point does lack of evidence for a natural death become evidence of foul play? On July 1st, there is a letter from Charles Sr. to Special Agent Devine. Now, the letter is marked with a note reading, "Ed, please return to me when digested. I will respond," indicating that, and I believe Ed must be Edward Levi. So what I'm thinking here, looking at it, is that Devine received this and then had it forwarded along to Attorney General Edward Levi, and that he wanted Edward Levi to digest it. So I'm getting a lot of hints here that there was not necessarily agreement within the FBI, and it seems like the FBI was trying to avoid investigating this, and not just because there was a lack of evidence. I think there's enough evidence here, and considering Charles Sr. as a prominent figure, again, as the FBI referred to him, not the newspaper. The FBI is the one that called him the prominent figure, the newspaper is the one who said Charles Sr. So, I think there was some disagreement within the FBI, and I think that the FBI was trying to avoid investigating this case for some reason. The letter from Charles Sr. opens by saying that he's sorry for the gap between his receiving the letter and his response, because he wanted to research hypothermia. Charles Sr. is quickly becoming a headache for the FBI. Which, by the way, there is nothing wrong with. You should be a headache for the FBI. He expresses that his opinion has not changed. He still thinks this was foul play, and he's disappointed that there has been no further investigation, that he feels like nobody has actually made any effort to figure out what happened to his son. He says he conferred with Chief Ranger Dan Shawley, and it was Chief Ranger Shawley's opinion that had he entered through the north entrance, it would have been pretty much impossible for him to get where he was found. The snow was likely 60 to 80 inches deep where he was going, and that is 152 to 207 centimeters, so those don't use the freedom units. So where Chuck supposedly died was about 60 to 80 inches of snow deep. To reach that without skis or snowshoes at all would be improbable, because you're literally walking through 5 to 7 feet of snow. And on top of that, it was 8 miles from the nearest road and a full mile from the nearest trail. So it's basically assuming that the route Charles took here was he took the road in, and then where the north entrance road intersects with the Pacific Coast Trail, hopped onto the Pacific Coast Trail, which again would have been buried in snow, and made his way down towards Bybee Creek. Without skis or snowshoes, hiking 8 miles through 5 to 7 foot deep snow it's just not something you can do. And it's not something that somebody who knew about the dangers of being outdoors and was experienced in camping would do. You simply don't do that. When Crater Lake Rangers discovered the scene that Charles' body was found at, they said that the clothes and the belongings and everything were scattered about in a 9-foot square area. But that is not the scene that the hikers stumbled across. You see, Charles Sr. had tracked him down. He had talked to him. And what they told him was that they discovered a pack, as well as socks, a shirt, a pair of jeans, and a ring of keys, all within 12 inches. The remaining clothes were inside of the pack, but the pack was open and the straps were broken. And it appears to Charles that the hikers had actually opened up the pack and emptied it out, scattering everything about, because that's the only reason it would make sense for them to, for clothes to be everywhere between them finding the pack and the Rangers finding the pack, and likely they just didn't want to admit that they had done that to the Rangers. The hikers also said that they had come across 2 cans of chili, but the cans of chili were not there when the Rangers arrived, and I have questions. As well as speaking to the hikers, Charles Sr. researched hypothermia. He spoke to several experts, and all of them told him that it would be impossible for somebody experiencing hypothermia not only to carry all of that deep into the park, but to even get that deep into the park. He could not have opened the chili cans. He would have been unable to open any food, a mess kit, anything like that, and he just would have been so weak that he would not have made it all that way. If it was just that cold, maybe, but it was that cold and in 5-foot deep snow. There was just no way. Now, Charles Sr. does admit that having investigated the scene and looked over the evidence, he didn't see any reason to suspect foul play of the stuff that was positively identified, of the things that were found. But it was the things that weren't found which led him to believe that something had happened to his son that was not simply exposure. So, considering the missing items, this is what Charles Sr. thinks Charles Jr. would have done when he bedded down for the night. He would have unrolled the sheet of black plastic and used it to make shelter. How? I don't know. Following that, he would have unrolled his sleeping bag and taken out his mess kit to eat. Before getting into his sleeping bag, he would have removed his jacket, snow shields, boots, bulky items such as knives, wallets, and change, and, gotten ready for bed. Since it was snowing or it might snow, he would have used his waterproof sleeping bag cover to store his camera and any other sensitive items. But his camera, his film, his lenses, and the sleeping bag cover, none of that was found at the scene. And as we established, because the foam sleeping pad, it wouldn't have washed away, it was too heavy. Furthermore, the camera, had it been recovered from the snow, would have absolutely been corroded and needed repairs. And anybody might stop there and say, that's a dead end. But no, Charles Sr. reached out to the manufacturer of the camera to confirm that no cameras of that model had been submitted to any service centers. And then, after the official investigation, Charles Sr. returned to the scene with a park official. It doesn't say who, it's redacted, but it can be assumed it was Dan Shelley. Dan Shally. Yes, Shally. The way they got there was by driving eastward on the Bybee Creek roadway, which I believe is only accessible from the park, but don't quote me on that. But they drove east along that road until it ended, they got out, and then they hiked their way to Bybee Creek. They went eastward for 3 miles up the south ridge of the creek, and then back west for 3 miles up the north ridge of the creek. And it was his opinion, having trekked that a snowmobile would have no trouble getting in or out of there. The trees were sparse, the ground was straight enough, there weren't any significant divots. It was totally possible for a snowmobile to make that trip. He says that the north slope is steep and devoid of trees, 2-tiered, and with snow on the ground would allow any object to slide down and across the frozen creek. This accounts for the body's location so close to the creek, with all of the items scattered just nearby. He basically suggested that somebody shoved Charles' body down that slope, and that he slid across the creek, and that's why the sleeping bag was half in the creek, that's why Charles' belongings were right next to him, and that's why Charles was in the position he was in. And then he goes on to ask Special Agent Devine for a meeting when he'll be in Oregon. July 6, 1977, a letter from the FBI to Charles Sr. Special Agent Devine is the one who wrote it, and he acknowledges receipt of the previous letter, offers reassurance that the case is not closed, and that he plans to be out of town for a period, but is available after in order to meet with Charles. He also notes that though he was not in Oregon when Charles Jr. went missing, he would still be happy to discuss. But just in case Charles wants to talk to somebody who was actually involved in the case, he offers him a special agent in Klamath Falls who was actually there. May 2nd, 1978, so we're having large gaps now, there is a memo to Special Agent in Charge Portland, I cannot confirm this was still John Devine, with an attached letter from Charles Sr. dated April 10th, 1978. So Charles Sr. had sent a letter on April 10th, and this memo was sent on May 2nd. The actual FBI memo, the government part, gives a brief description of events. There's a very dismissive attitude towards the case. Charles Sr. is just causing trouble. He's just getting in the way. The case is closed. It's over. There was no foul play. Come on, just let it go. All Charles had done, though, was reach out to the FBI asking if there was any new evidence. And he notes that the meaning in the second paragraph, which I will read, I will tell you what he says. He says the meaning is unclear because Charles has been informed multiple times about the nature of this case and the FBI's position. That position being there is no active investigation due to a lack of evidence. But the thing is, Charles was informed on March 27th, 1978, that the file on Chuck had been closed. And of course he was upset because he was informed that the file would not be closed just before that. Just months before that. So you can imagine that Charles Sr. calling the FBI asking for an update on his son would have been a little frustrated when told that the case was closed. In the letter, Charles requests what he presumes must be the conclusive evidence that has emerged to say that Chuck either was the victim of a crime or not the victim of a crime. Now, of course, it seems pretty sarcastic. On July 12, 1978, there is another letter from Charles Sr. to the FBI in Klamath Falls requesting evidence. The same evidence he had requested in April. And this seems to be the point at which the FBI just is fed up, does not want to deal with it anymore, and decides to tell Charles off. On August 1st, 1978, there is a letter from Special Agent Borger to Charles Sr. acknowledging receipt, but also admitting there is no new evidence. And I quote, "In fact, as you know, there has never been a shred of evidence to indicate that foul play was involved." Any sensible person would disagree with that statement. As pointed out in previous correspondence, it appears that Charles simply became lost and died from exposure. So the FBI is reiterating the point that it made before it even actually investigated anything, having had investigation, having had numerous letters from Charles Sr. expressing why he thinks that foul play was involved, and at no point have they or the Oregon State Police ever launched an investigation into foul play. Nobody has, they have not looked for evidence, so no wonder they don't have any. And yet the FBI seems to think that they're in the position to say Charles Sr. is the one being unreasonable. No, Charles Sr. is asking them to investigate what very clearly was not a death by exposure because it was impossible that Chuck ever got there in the first place. And the FBI just consistently over and over and over again refuses to investigate and then treats Charles like he's the ridiculous one. And yet, their response is this. Also, it seems completely illogical to us that had someone abducted your son, he would have been taken to such an extremely remote spot since his abductors would have also faced severe snow conditions. However, Charles Sr. suggested, based on his going and doing the investigation himself, that it would have been completely possible for a snowmobile to get there. So there are no severe snow conditions for someone with a snowmobile to be handling. The FBI didn't do their job, they're refusing to do their job, and aside from complete laziness, there is no reason I can imagine the FBI didn't bother doing their job unless they were trying to avoid uncovering something. That said, pure laziness and apathy would be par for the course for the FBI for anything that doesn't involve framing American citizens for crimes against the government. But he does go on to say that the case is not closed and perhaps it's just a semantic issue, it's just not actively being investigated. He is insistent that this has been an accident, but he doesn't actually refute a single one of Charles Sr.'s points. He just ignores them and then tells Charles Sr. he's crazy. On August 21st, 1978, we have another FBI document, and this one is about the McCuller case. It just summarizes the efforts by McCuller and reaffirms the position that this entire thing was, in fact, an accident. The final paragraph notes that McCuller called a week earlier, before this document went out, asking for the special agent in charge, was offered the supervisor in charge of crimes on government reservations, but declined, saying he'd just get in touch with FBI HQ, which means that Charles Sr. was pretty confident that FBI HQ, that he had enough pull, somehow, to get the FBI to do what he wanted through their actual director. And then, on August 30th, 1978, there is a letter from the special agent in charge in Portland to the FBI director informing him that the traveler's checks were marked deceased by Bank of America. Why? That is a very random document. That is a very random thing to tell somebody. I have a hard time believing that that document was sent for no reason, but I also don't know what it could possibly be. This case was weird in a way we didn't expect. What I was expecting when I started researching this was that Charles McCullar's remains were found in a weird orientation, and nobody could really explain what happened, and he had been gone for a really long time, and there should have been evidence, but in reality, most of the stories that make this case seem so weird that you'll find on the internet are making it weird for the wrong reason. They're saying that the position of his body, like that parts of his body were missing that shouldn't have been missing, and there was no explanation for any of that. In reality, the position in which his body was found is completely explicable, but the explanation is foul play. The FBI refused to investigate foul play when it was staring them in the face. Glaringly obvious. Charles Sr. walked them through the process. He flew it, he hiked it, he camped it, he did everything possible. The rangers at the park, the experts on the park, agreed that it was extremely unlikely that anyone could make it that far into the park in those conditions. Again, remember, think about it. Think about the people that you know that are 2 meters tall, that are 6 feet tall. That is how high the snow was. Charles was 6'3". That means he would have been up to here in snow, trying to walk through it. He would have needed snowshoes that he didn't have. He had no reason to construct snowshoes. So why was he found 12 miles into the park? Why was he found a mile from the nearest trail? In fact, if you look at it, he's found just far enough off the trail that somebody would look at it and say, oh, well, you know, maybe he just got lost and hiked off the trail and died of exposure. But he's also just 3 miles from the nearest access road. Now, in order to get where he was, there were 2 possibilities. Either he hiked in through the north entrance into a park that was closed with snow 60 to 90 inches deep. Again, in some places there were 100 inches of snow on the ground. So, either he hiked from the north entrance down the road to where it intersects with the Pacific Coast Trail, then another 7 miles along the Pacific Coast Trail, which again was covered in snow, 5 to 8 feet of it, walked all the way down that, got to near Bybee Creek, went off the trail an entire mile, and then fell into the creek and died. Or somebody kidnapped him, murdered him, drove him down the road to Bybee Creek roadway, hopped onto a snowmobile, and drove him 3 miles into the park. Which of those 2 things sounds more likely to you? Is it more likely that a 150-pound man managed to walk 12 miles in 5 to 8 foot deep snow and then died, and his belongings were, of course, in weird places? You know, this doesn't even suggest that he died of exposure. He's just there. It doesn't look like he wasn't in the creek. According to them, it looks like he was laying flat on his back when he died. Or somebody drove him there, and the FBI refused to investigate. And then, of course, there is the final possibility here, which is that he was picked up by a Wendigo and dropped there. But under the circumstances, it seems far more likely that what happened here was exactly what I just said, that he was driven in there, that he was killed somewhere else and driven in. Now, of course, his body would decompose if he was simply stabbed a bunch of times, for example, around your lower body, your abdomen. There would be no sign on the bones. There would be no way to know that he died of foul play. Now, there is the fact that none of the clothing scraps they found had blood on them, but maybe they killed him, cleaned him up, and then left him there. There's a bunch of possibilities here. No matter what way you look at this case, it seems plainly obvious to any person with at least 3 brain cells that this was foul play, that someone killed Charles and kidnapped him and drove him somewhere else. But because the entire FBI only has 2 brain cells to share, they couldn't figure that out. That, or they decided to completely ignore all of the evidence right in front of them just to, save themselves some time? At the end of the day, it was 50 years ago. What is there to really do about it? But to me, it seems like the FBI had a murder of a prominent person in the state of Virginia. Obviously, that's across the country, but this Charles Sr. guy, according to every bit of evidence there is, was well connected. So they chose to just not investigate the death of the son of a very well-connected man. If this had been the child of a politician, the FBI would have been all over it. One of America's soldiers, and they don't care? It seems like they're trying to hide something. So why? I will leave you to think with that question. If you like what we're doing here at the Lore Lodge, you can check us out on Patreon for just $1 a month. You can get access to exclusive content, message me, and I'll actually answer you because I am paid to answer you, and I would feel bad taking your money and not even answering your questions. So you can do that. You can also check out our coffee from Tableau Roasting Company. It is called Mount Pocono Perk, and it is delicious. It is definitely a little more on the darker end, so if that's what you're into, check it out. If that's not what you're into, still check it out, because honestly, it's pretty good. We also have an Amazon storefront you can check out, and you can, of course, just share the video. That would be nice. Smash the like button, hit the notification bell. I'm going to be honest with you, it's 12:15 at night on a Wednesday. What? Oh, right. And, of course, you can always check us out live to discuss these things on our podcast. That is Sunday nights at 7 p.m. Eastern Time here on this channel, and you can catch the audio replays of that wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Aiden Mattis, and thanks for stopping by the Lore Lodge.